Greetings, everyone. I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, it's time for another movie review. And it's a review for the first part of a series that I don't think I've ever really talked about in depth on this channel, or even my previous one, except maybe in passing years ago. That, of course, is the Indiana Jones franchise. And this is, of course, the film that started it all. This, of course, is Raiders of the Lost Ark. As you can tell, this is the later re-release of the VHS. I do have an earlier VHS somewhere in the pile. It's just this one is newer and the video quality is probably a bit better, so I kept it in the front. I, of course, watched it on Netflix, so I got to see it in HD for the first time ever. It's a film I haven't seen in years, and as a whole, before I get in depth, I could say it definitely holds up. Not my favorite of the series. I still say Crusades is probably going to be my favorite, but I'll get to that comment when I get around to rewatching and reviewing Crusade. Now, all three of these films were a big part of my childhood, like Total Recall, RoboCop, the first three TMNT films, Predator 2. They're films that I would watch constantly. After a while, and we lost our original VHSs, I stopped watching them, but I would watch them constantly. Like, go to my grandmother's house, other grandmother's house, pop them in, watch them. But I will say, of the three, Raiders was the one that I remember watching the least for some reason. I don't know what it is. Even before this rewatch, there are scenes from the movie I remember Andy getting on the sub. I remember a little bit of the Well of Souls. I mainly remember, snakes. Why did it have to be snakes? Of course, the boulder. But most of the other Indiana Jones scenes that I have memories of from childhood are from Temple of Doom. Kalima and Last Crusade. The whole night thing, the Grail, even scenes before that. It's just, for some reason, those two stuck with me more. Maybe it's because I connected more with those ones. Of course, with Temple of Doom, you also got Short Round. No time for love, Dr. Jones. That character, which as a kid, obviously I'm going to identify more with the film that has a kid, like, see myself as a kid, especially when he gets to fight. I mean, other than films where all the leads are kids, like Goonies and Monster Squad, what other film are you going to see where the main character is an adult, where a kid actually gets to have a fight scene of his own? There are probably some, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. Directed by Steven Spielberg and starring Harrison Ford, the genesis for this film came in the wake of Star Wars Episode 4. Lucas and Spielberg were on vacation right when the film was premiering. Box office receipts came back and it was a hit. Which is an aside, out of all of Lucas's friends, Spielberg was the only one who thought Star Wars was going to be a hit. The rest of his friends were like, it's going to flop. I mean, even when he showed them a rough cut, they're like, it doesn't make any sense. But Spielberg was like, this movie's going to make a lot of money. It's kind of funny when you look at who is in that friend group. That's the same friend group that includes people like Coppola. Well, they're on vacation. Spielberg's like, George, I've always wanted to do a James Bond movie, which is an aside. Spielberg doing a Bond film would be interesting from a technical standpoint alone. And then Lucas is like, I got a better idea. I've been wanting to do an adventure movie. And there we have it. Star Wars was inspired by the old space opera serials like Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, which is an aside because he couldn't get the rights to do Flash Gordon, which eventually happened in the early 80s, the film with the Queen soundtrack. That's why he decided to do a film inspired by it instead. So they went from one archetype of the serial age with the space opera and jumped to the next one, the adventure serial. And if you look at a lot of the adventure serials from that time period, you definitely see how Spielberg and Lucas were influenced by it. From a lot of the action, how it's paced, to even Indiana Jones's name and his outfit. I mean, look at other characters like Humphrey Bogart in this Treasure of the Sierra Madre. There's a Charlton Heston film where he's dressed in a similar fashion. So for those who grew up on those type of films, they would know this archetype. They look at it and go, oh yeah, that's what it's dressed from. As it's always said, what's old is new again. And a film like that had been made in quite some time, so repackaging it in this film, using a director that is very great behind the camera, you elevate it from B-level material to A-level material with the execution. It's just like RoboCop. On the surface, you would think that'd be a B movie, and it could have been, but you got Verhoeven behind the camera, it became an A movie. Same thing with Alien. It could have been a B movie, with the right director and Ridley Scott, became an A movie. And to even tie in with the fact that Indiana Jones has its roots in the old adventure serials, the tagline for the film is The Return of the Great Adventure. Can't get a better tagline for a love letter to classic adventure cinema than that. And to even complement that point further, John Williams' amazing score even feels like something that would be in an adventure serial. Just that upbeat main theme, dun 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 dun. Everyone knows the theme. And then all the other undercurrents, the slightly romantic one, the mysterious score, they all feel like they're ripped out of an adventure serial, which just shows how much of a genius, more so back in the day, he still is now, but more so in his heyday, what a genius John Williams was. And you can even say the same thing about his Star Wars score, that it definitely feels like it's out of a space opera. Of course, with that one also has the added benefit that this was at a time period where not many people were doing normal scores like that. Now, before I get too far ahead of myself, I might want to relay the plot a little bit, but I think everybody knows the plot of Indiana Jones, each film. But Raiders of the Lost Ark, of course, we get the famous opening bit where we are introduced to the character, where he's going through a lost tomb somewhere in South America to find this idol. He gets it, but he gets the weight ratio wrong, and he's chased by the boulder in that famous scene. He runs into his long-running arch-nemesis Belloc, a French archaeologist, played by Paul Freeman, who would go on, of course, to play Ivan Ooze in Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the movie. It's very interesting when you compare how over-the-top he is in that film to how he's a little bit more subdued in here. A little bit of fop in his character, but I think they're playing up the fact that, oh, I am the French archaeologist, I have to be a little snooty. But he's not super over-the-top like John Cleese's The Frenchman in Monty Python, but that's comedy, so you can see why they go with more over the top there, whereas in here, he is a little comic, but he's a little bit more serious, but he's not the main antagonist. He's like the secondary antagonist. He steals the idol, and of course, Indy gets chased. He eventually gets back to his teaching job, where he's approached by his longtime colleague and friend, Marcus Brody, who tells him he's being approached by people from the U.S. government about a transmission involving an old friend of his, Mr. Ravenwood. And Indy hasn't seen him in years. They had a falling out, which it's a very interesting falling out, and I like how we don't find out what this falling out was until a couple scenes afterwards. But since he was mentioned in a Nazi transmission involving the location of the Lost Ark, they figure, hey, we'll get the guy that learned under him to help us find it. And he agrees for a fee, and he's like, if there's any place to find Arthur, we're going to have to go find his daughter. Next thing you know, Indy's on his way to Nepal to find Marion, the daughter of his mentor, played by Karen Allen, mainly to try to find his mentor, but he finds out his mentor's passed away, so I was like, alright, I needed something that your father had. It's not the best meeting, and this is where we find out exactly what the falling out was over. It was that Indy was romancing Marion, and they don't come out and state it other than one bit of dialogue, but it's implied through this bit of dialogue that she was technically underage during it, and since he's about 10 years older than her, he would be in his mid-20s, maybe even his early 30s during it, which nowadays this is one part that really hasn't aged well, but when you look at it through the lens of the 1930s, it is a bit more common for older men to romance women young like that. Not excusing it, but through the lens of the time, it makes sense a little bit. And of course, it is what led to his falling out with Ravenwood, because he's like, no, you're not seeing my daughter. We don't get the specifics of what went down other than Indy left. A couple years after that, it looks like his mentor died. And through the lens of hindsight, Marion knows that it was wrong, and she articulates when Indiana Jones comes in through her door. And of course, this leads to it not being the best reunion of former lovers, and even Indy's trying to counter it, like, you knew what you were doing. Which is a line that really doesn't age well when you think about it, but through the lens of the time and the archetype Indy is, it makes sense. I mean, it's like James Bond. Yeah, he's a sexist to a point, but that's the point. It's supposed to be a character flaw. Although with this, you can maybe chalk it up to Indy trying to keep a tough exterior to try to get what he wants. And no, that's not supposed to be sexualized, that line. He kind of does end up rekindling his romance with Marion as the film goes, but it feels natural. Because they start as partners once the Nazis show up, having tracked down Mr. Jones to try to steal the amulet he's there to get from Marion that will lead them to the Lost Ark. Doesn't work so well, so now Marion and Indy have to be on the down low to try to get the Ark before the Nazis do, working with his friend Sala, played by John Rhys-Davies. But he works good with Harrison Ford. They have some good back and forth, which... It starts here. I think it's a bit more natural in the next film, but The film takes place a couple years later, so they've been friends for a lot longer by that point, so it makes sense that it'd be a lot more natural there, especially since the stakes are a bit higher there when it comes to directly impacting the characters. As the film goes on, there's a lot of twists and turns, and he gets into a lot of fights. He gets attacked. There's that famous scene where he just shoots the guy who, after he postulated with the sword, which I think everybody knows originally he was supposed to disarm him with the whip. But Harrison Ford had food poisoning, and he was just like, why don't we just shoot him? Because I guess a couple takes couldn't get it right, which if you have food poisoning, just being able to act through dialogue alone is tough, but having to do an action scene, boy, I feel for poor Harrison Ford. And even looking at it, you can kind of tell in some of those fight scenes that he might not have been in the best health during them. But they still feel authentic enough. But you can definitely tell by the time he gets to that moment, he's letting his health come out a little bit. But that's to sell the fact he just finished fighting off a couple bad guys. Of course, the famous fight underneath the plane where he fights the big old burly Nazi. The guy is like, hero? You mean toilet paper? You know, that type of burly man. I just love how he just comes up to Andy like, where do you think you're going? We'll go to settle this like men. Probably not like that, but be like, I'm benuten bitter. I don't really know German, so. And of course, later on with the rocket launcher. And of course, there's the pit scene I've already mentioned, snakes. Why did it have to be snakes? Which, fun thing about that scene is if you pay close attention to it, you'll see that a lot of those snakes are not actually snakes. They're legless lizards, which are more docile. You'd have to look carefully. You notice the ear hole, like, that's a legless lizard, legless lizard, legless lizard. And even though Sala says asps, the only venomous snake we really see in there is that one cobra that both Marion and Indy land in front of that rears up. Other than that, it's legless lizards, pythons, and a couple shots, I guess, hoses. Funny thing is, I guess one of the pythons bit the hand of the first assistant director. He had to have someone come up, grab it, and then whip it to get it off. Which I'm guessing he just was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But let's just say it's better that a python bit him than that cobra, because then it would have been like, oh crap. Because unlike the Macho Man, I don't think that snake has been devenomized. But as Jake said, never trust a snake. Of course, it makes me wonder, were they treating the snakes, at least the pythons, the best? Did that happen after a couple of the shots they got where the python was like leaning like, because there's a couple of shots where you see the pythons do that. Did it happen right after they stopped filming? Was it when they were filming one of the takes and then he had his hand in the wrong place? Questions that might be answered on a commentary, but I only have that, so it's a question I'll probably find out the answer to one of these days. It goes without saying that this film was a critical and financial success. Forgive me, I actually have to read this off the phone. The film cost about $18 million in early 80s money to make, and you definitely see a lot of that money up on the screen. And it made $248 million domestically, and the worldwide gross was $390 million, which, even after inflation, that's still a pretty good chunk of change. Even without inflation, compared to its budget, that is still a pretty good chunk of change. Can't really think of that many films nowadays made for $18 million, but it's usually like low-budget comedies. Like Haunted House, I think, costs $5 million. But it's few and far between. Most of the time, a low-budget film nowadays is like, $30 million? That's low budget. And then it's like, only. And it also won 4 Oscars. It won for set decoration, best sound, definitely deserved for the ending scene alone. Film editing, definitely deserved it. Just look at how crisp those action scenes are. You can actually see what's going on. I know it's weird that I bring that to mind, but it's like, seems to be a lost art nowadays. It's always quick cut, quick cut. I mean, Spielberg kind of did that as well in the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, but it's a war movie, so it kind of adds to the whole feeling of actually being at war. Here, all the crispness, you're able to see everything, and it ties in beautifully to the fact that this is a love letter to the classic action-adventure serials. And, of course, best visual effects, which the ending scene that I mentioned already, for that alone, it deserved the Oscar. Just the way you see the villains melt as the spirits come out of the ark, and they're so sacred it'll burn your eyes out. You know, the model work, everything. It's just that scene alone sums up the special effects and how it was used in this film perfectly. And of course, it also got a special achievement for sound effects editing. Definitely with the action scenes and, of course, the ending and the screaming and all that. Of course, some of the special effects involve a baseball bat on leather, and, of course, it goes wonderfully with the fight scenes, especially that one under the plane. Makes the blows sound like they have a lot of power behind them. It was nominated for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Cinematography, and Best Original Score, which all deserved nominations. In addition to that, it also did well at the Saturn Awards, which better fits the genre, even if it isn't as well known as the Oscars. It won for Best Fantasy Film, Best Actor for Harrison Ford, Actress for Karen Allen. Spielberg took the Best Director. Lawrence Kasdan took Best Writing. Oh, nice to see him actually winning a writing award somewhere. John Williams took for Best Music. Visual Effects won again. Paul Freeman got Best Supporting Actor nomination, and Costumes got a nomination there too, so nice. Did a little bit better there if you think about it. About the same amount of nominations, but more wins overall. So, did pretty well. And as you can tell by how enthusiastically I'm talking, the film does hold up. Paced well, the action sits, the acting from Ford, Allen, and the rest of the cast, perfect. You definitely believe our lead hero and heroine are old flames and their romance is rekindling, and of course, in a later scene that is kind of a lovemaking scene without it being a lovemaking scene. We do get that one line that Harrison Ford ad-libbed. It's not the years, it's the mileage, which is a pretty accurate line. Like, yeah, you could be young and still have gone through a lot to the point where your body's like, oh. And then, of course, you can also be old and be like, The villains are despicable. They're not my favorite villains in the series, but for a film that could have been a standalone, they work. And, of course, they're Nazis, and not really a lot is made out of their hatred of the Jews, other than one line that the secondary Nazi says, I do not know about this Jewish ritual. That's not exactly how he says it, but that gets the point across. And a lot of the minor characters, and of course the U.S. government in its small role. Definitely, you can see the government doing this. Like, we got our hands on the Ark. We're gonna study it. Put it in the box. Put it in the box. Put it in the box. I can definitely see them doing it. That's actually one moment I do remember from this film, seeing as a kid, just putting them in the box. I'm like, what the? As a kid, I didn't understand why. Now watching it, I'm like, those sons of bitches. Now, I know nowadays a lot is made about this film, about how Indiana Jones's role in the main plot is minuscule, and the Nazis would have ended up with their comeuppance if he had done nothing. Having watched this film again, to a point, I get that mindset, but it's ignoring the fact that they would not have found the Ark when they did without his interference. Now there's a possibility that eventually they would have started digging there, they would have gotten down and be like, oh, we found it! And dealt with the snakes and all that on their own. But there's also the possibility by the time they figured out where it was, World War II would have been even further on the way, and it might have been a time where it was like, dun 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 dun. Oh, I love the smell of Europe in the morning. Oh, well, we're invading North Africa first? Alright. Oh, we found the Ark! Yeah. The Americans might have entered the war, and then they would have had to stop digging due to, they have to fight the Americans. And there's also, which also leads to another head scratcher, like, how were the Germans able to just waltz in with impunity and start digging? I mean, I'd have to bring up a map to find out exactly where they're supposed to be digging. Like, if this was Egypt, there's no way they would be able to waltz in here easily like this. Maybe, like, 1940 they would be able to, but in the 30s, it's like, you guys forget the Brits controlled Egypt at that point? How would they be able to just waltz in without impunity? You don't see even a British soldier coming in going, nope, nope, nope. I think not. You will not be digging here. Now, if it's in more the Middle East area, which I'm assuming it probably is going to be, I could kind of see in certain areas they might be able to. I'd have to do some more research on this, probably before I record the review for the next one, just to see the specific location, see if the Germans would be able to go in there. But back on my main topic. They might have been able to find it before the Americans, but then there's a possibility you might not have. Now, once the Germans do get their hands on the Ark, and it becomes a back and forth of, it's mine, it's mine, it's mine, it's mine, before, of course, they open it, Indy could have just let them keep the Ark, they would have gone there, opened it, and then they would have been taken care of. Once that point happens, you have a point. But it also ignores the fact that Indy is trying to keep them from taking the Ark. And it's not until the point till Belloc reasons with him about, hey, you're going to destroy history, you're curious to see what's inside too, that he decides like, what the hell. Before that, he'd rather see it destroyed than the Nazis have control of it, especially if they turn it over to Adolf Hitler himself. Of course, which leads to another funny thing, open it in front of Hitler, open it in front of Hitler. I mean, they mention it, but then that's the reason they open it there, because they don't want to open it in front of the Führer. Of course, if they did that, we'd have alternate history like Inglourious Bastards. What's inside this? That type of scene would be funny. See Hitler's face melting. Insert line from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Anyone order sauerkraut? But the point is, he does not want them to have their hands on it, so hence him still interfering. So to say his point in the plot after that is inconsequential kind of does a disservice to his character motivation. His super objective, to use acting terminology. It just boils it down to, they still would have died. Like, yeah, but it's the same. He would not want them to have their hands on it. One little interesting cinematic historical note to mention about this film, other than, with being the start of its own series, making a lot of money, multiple Oscars, and of course, the whole what's old is new again when it comes to action adventure films of the serial era. To mention about this film is that it was on the set of this film during a filming break on location that Spielberg and Melissa Matheson started spitballing another film that they could do after this. And those of you who already know where I'm going, don't start typing. Those who don't, they started spitballing on a film that never was, which of course was Night Sky. And you can make a video alone on that. Maybe one of these days I'll do a video essay video on it. And of course, that film eventually fractured down and it split apart into two separate films that became iconic in the 80s. Poltergeist, which was produced by Spielberg, and E.T., which Spielberg directed, which came out the same year as The Thing. And when you watch those two films, you get a yin and yang of interactions with aliens. But Night Sky was supposed to essentially be, imagine a house terrorized like in Poltergeist, but only with aliens, and there's one good alien like E.T. It's a never was, but it's one of those things that'd be interesting to see happen, but I highly doubt. And of course the reason there's not an official documentary about it on DVD or even on the Poltergeist one is because of Spielberg and him flipping his lid when it comes to certain things, him basically trashing Rick Baker's shop, stealing his artwork, which, if you don't believe he stole his artwork, look at Baker's designs that he did for Night Sky before that film got put on indefinite suspension. And then look at E.T. and try and tell me he didn't get ripped off without the credit given him. I rest my case. In conclusion, Raiders of the Lost Ark is a cinematic classic. While from a standpoint of it being not original, it does take all the old cliches of the action-adventure serials, gives them a new coat of paint, gives it a higher budget, and gives it a director who does have a great vision. And the writing, the acting, all the elements of mise-en-scène come together to make an excellent film. Like I said earlier, takes what would have been a B-movie plot, makes it A movie due to everything coming out top-notch. While might not be my favorite of the series, it paved the way for its successors, and it is a very entertaining adventure film, and it is definitely a film that everybody should watch. I haven't had the chance to see it on the big screen yet, but if the chance ever does come, you bet your butt I'm going to be going there, whether I have to hitchhike or go by plane with a snake as my passenger. Because unlike Indy, I don't hate snakes.